Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are on chapter 10, verse 17. We're talking about the fact that it says in the pasuk that God doesn't take bribery. And the question is, I get that God doesn't take bribery, but if he took bribery, what would that bribery be? So we said Rashi talks about money, which is just an interesting thing. The Ramban talks about mitzvos, meaning that a mitzvah doesn't offset an avera. And that if a person deserves reward for mitzvahs, still get rewards. If a person deserves punishment for avera, still get punishments. One doesn't offset the other. We're still in this Ramban. So in the Ramban on Yud Zayin, it's probably around 15, 20 lines into the Ramban, beginning with V'unklis. V'unklis tirgem, the less kadamoy mesav apin, that there is not before him turning of the face, v'aflo l'kabala shochta, and not even to accept bribery. A little bit difficult to understand what that means. So the Ramban says the intent of the unklis is yiskavin lefareshu mishivchei hasholus babori yisbarach. This is part of the praise of what's not so with God. Yomar shein Hashem be'inyan sheyisa panim kilo yirani hadam v'chai. No one can even see God and live. So the previous phrase had been he doesn't sort of turn to a face because nobody can even look God in the face. No human being. Everything is nothing compared to him. Imagine a king who has everything. And someone wants to bribe the king. It's a farce. What do you mean you're going to bribe the king? What are you going to give him? There's nothing you could give him that he doesn't have. So whereas other Mefarshim have been explaining that God doesn't accept bribery because this is a reflection of God's principles or God's policies or whatever it is, the Unkla says it's preposterous to talk about God accepting bribery because there's nothing you could give God that he doesn't have. That's how the Unkla explains it. And now the Ramban says what he really thinks the pshat is. That he doesn't raise faces, Ligdole b'nei Adam berivam imktaneim, that he doesn't demonstrate a face to great people in their fights with small people. V'lo yikach me'ashireim shochad berivam imdaleim, and he's not going to take bribery from wealthy people in their arguments with impoverished people. So it's a very interesting idea. Just imagine the following situation. You have a great person, whatever has done great mitzvahs, is a great person in the community, et cetera, and they get into a personal argument with a relatively simple person. So one might look at the situation and say, well, we know whose corner God is in. One person is like this big, important person. And the answer is that's not the way God operates. And maybe there's a person who's having some argument with, maybe there's a person who funds half of the programs of the community who's having some argument with a person who has money provided to him by half of the charities in the community. And again, you say to yourself, well, I guess I know whose side God is going to be on. And the answer is no, you don't. God doesn't play any favorites. If someone's right, they're right. And that's the pshat according to the Ramban. And the Ramban says that this is really a continuation of the famous idea that we say elsewhere in the Torah, ki hu oseh mishpat yasom va'almanah, that if there's an orphan, if there's a widow who's wronged in some way, God will evoke justice for them. What does that mean? What that means is God looks out for the underdog. If they're wrong, they're wrong. But if they're justified, of course God will take care of them, etc. It's the people who don't have anyone to look out for them that God looks out for the most. So it's a nice thing to think about. So we have a number of ideas here about what it means that God doesn't take bribery. Okay, moving on to chapter 11, verse 1. Chapter 11, verse 1. You should love Hashem your God. You should guard his guardianship. V'chukosav umishpatav umitzvosav, and his various different laws. Kol hayamim. Should guard these things all of the days. What does it mean to guard God's guardianship? What does that mean exactly? Just what do the words mean? Ramban and Pasuk Aleph v'shamarto mishmarto liyiroso. You need to have reverence for God. You should guard yourself from sinning. You should hold yourself back from sinning before him. God instructs, Moshe is instructing the Jewish people that we should serve God with love. But then right after, that's the first part of the pasuk. But then right after that, it says you should guard his conduct, which means you should make sure not to violate his commandments, which means you should have reverence for God. Oh, v'shamarto mishmarto, shetishmor masha Hashem shomer. This is actually a very nice follow-up to what we saw a moment ago. You should guard that which Hashem guards. Shu shomer es hagerim. God looks out for the convert. V'chonein dalim ve'evyonim, and he has compassion on the impoverished. V'osem mishpat yasom v'almana. And as we said before, he brings justice for the orphan and the widow. The idea being, think about what God cares about in this world, the unique things that God, the unique people that God cares about in this world, and you look out for them, just like God looks out for you, just like God looks out for them. So that's just interesting. Pshat. Okay, moving on. Verse 6. Actually, let's start with verse 3. Moshe is telling the Jewish people, remember all the great things that God has done. So in verse 3, he says, remember all the things he did to the Egyptians because they wronged you. In verse 4, he says, remember what happened at the splitting of the sea when the Egyptian army chased after you. In verse 5, it says, think about all the things that happened at the desert. And now in verse 6, and don't forget what God did to Dasan and Aviram. They, of course, were people who we've heard from various times in the Chumash, but their last stand, literally, was when they partnered with Korach. Asher patzasaharetz espia, the earth opened up its mouth, vativlaim v'yasbatzehem v'esoleihem, and swallowed up them, their possessions, their tents. Right in the middle of Klal Yisrael, Dasan and Aviram and everything they had were swallowed up. And then we move on. So there's a very obvious omission here. If you're going to talk about what happened to Dasan and Aviram in that story, why don't you talk about what happened to Korach? Why don't you talk about what happened to the people who lit the incense? Why are we only saying part of the story? So the Ramban on Pasuk Vav, v'hizkir asher asal Dasan v'Aviram, below hizkir Korach v'Adaso, shiatza eish b'fnei Hashem v'tochal osam. It doesn't mention Korach and his people, that a flame came out and consumed them. Why not? Bavur ki ishzar hakarev lahaktir Torah humilave Torah. Interestingly, says the Ramban, it's a Torah prohibition to light the incense if you're not the Kohen lighting the incense. Uliolam hunan ashel doros, and we're not surprised if someone gets punished for violating a commandment of God. Therefore, it's not considered to be from the remarkable signs of the desert. The miracles of the plagues of Egypt and splitting of the sea, those are remarkable signs. The fact that the earth opened up for Dasan and Aviram, that's pretty remarkable. That ranks on the remarkable scale. But the fact that somebody got punished for flat out Avera in the Torah, it's not so remarkable. Just an interesting shot. Okay. Now let's go to chapter 11, verse 13. Chapter 11, verse 13. This should be familiar. This is the second paragraph of Shema. If you listen to my mitzvos, that I command you today, to serve Hashem your God, to love Hashem your God, and to serve Him with all of your heart and all of your soul. Verse 14, if you do that, I'll provide rain at the right time. That'll generate grain for you. All these things will work out well for you. But be careful in verse 16. Maybe your heart will turn away and you'll serve other gods, and God will become angry at you, and the rain will not come, and the land will not generate for you. Okay, now, we're used to saying this paragraph immediately after we say a paragraph from last week's parsha, which is the first paragraph of the Shema. Whereas the first paragraph of the Shema just sort of focuses on the relationship between Hashem and man, the second paragraph, and just sort of our responsibility to Him, the second paragraph of Shema talks about that, but then goes on to talk about what happens if we don't serve Him correctly. But what's very striking is even if they're not consecutive paragraphs, which is how they are in the Siddur, but it's not how they are in the Chumash, how many times do you have to tell me to love God with all of my heart and all of my soul? The pasuk at the beginning of the first paragraph of Shema says that, and verse 13 says it again. How many times do you have to tell me that? So let's see the Ramban on pasuk Yud Gimel. B'chol levavchem v'chol nafshechem. Ba'lo kvar hizkir b'chol levavchem v'chol nafshecha. It already said that. You're all of your heart and all of your soul. Ella azhara liyachid v'azhara l'tzibur. So Rashi says it's a different world because in the first paragraph of Shema, it's in the singular. It's talking to a person reading the Chumash. The second paragraph of Shema, it's in the plural. If you look at the words, if you're familiar with the grammar, clearly the second paragraph of Shema, including verse 13, is in the plural. And so the point is, the first paragraph of Shema is a directive to love God with all of your heart and soul as a person. The second paragraph of Shema, to love God with your heart and soul, is as a nation. That's what Rashi says. Now, that's very interesting. It's a very logical distinction, but the question is, why does that matter? What's the point? Uviyah ha'inyan, says the Ramban, the meaning is, Ki Hashem yisparach lo yasa hanisim tamid lo seis b'tara aretz b'choles yaro malkosh lohosif badagan v'sirosh v'yitzar ularbos gamo esav basad labahema oshiyatzor shamayim v'yivashu. God's making a pretty big guarantee here in the second paragraph of Shema. You know, if you do my mitzvahs, all these great things will happen. Wow. Is that, yeah? Every time a person does the mitzvahs, they'll be wealthy. They'll have everything they need. That's wonderful. Ramban says, no. Rak al maseh rov ha'am. That assurance that God gives is only if Klal Yisrael on the national scale, if the majority of the Jewish people are serving God with all of their heart and all of their soul. Then God says, no matter what the laws of nature would say at that point, you have my assurance that everything is going to go well for you. By the way, as an aside, it's talking about in the land of Israel. It's not saying that if everybody in Silver Spring is doing a great job, you know, there'll be a bumper crop. It's not what it's saying. It's saying if Klal Yisrael as a whole is serving God wonderfully, there'll be wonderful crops in the land of Israel. Aval yachid, hu b'schuso yichyeh, v'hu b'avono yamos. An individual, God measures him by his mitzvos, saveros. But there's not an assurance that if things are going well, if he's serving God well, that he'll have a phenomenal career. We don't have an assurance like that. V'hinei omar ki ba'asosam kol hamitzvos me'ava shlema yasei moem es kol nismael l'tova. But actually, it's even more than I just said, because it's not just if we serve God well as a nation. If we serve God well with full love, which I think practically speaking means we're emotionally engaged in it. There's a lot of people who do the mitzvos but aren't tapped into it. They're just doing it. So that's the point. The Ramban says the reason why this passage needs to be repeated is it's framing the assurance that comes from the next psukim. And it's saying that all those wonderful assurances are if we as a nation serve God with all of our heart and all of our soul with a real sense of love. So we discussed this morning some additional possibilities and what it means that God doesn't accept bribery. We discussed what it means to guard God's guardianship. We discussed why Korach and the people who got punished with the lighting of the incense are not mentioned, where Dasan and Aviram are mentioned. And we discussed a significant nuance between the first and the second chapters of the Shema.